Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. We're kicking things off with major headlines that are reshaping our region and the world. Turkey has rolled out new parts for its game-changing steel dome air defense system, a powerful signal of its drive for technological independence as tensions flare across the Middle East. On the program today, we'll discuss Ukraine's massive rebuilding efforts, which are opening doors for Poland and Germany. But it comes with steep financial risks and geopolitical setbacks. We'll also take a look at the occupied Gaza Strip as Gulf states say they are ready to pour funds into reconstruction, a move that could send ripples through global oil markets. Joining me to discuss the latest developments are Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar and Laurent Lecoeur, founder of The Macro Butler.
Engellere rağmen inancın ve azmin neleri başardığını görmek isteyenler bugün açık söylüyorum Türk savunma sanayine bakıyor.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan delivered a speech at the Technofest Blue Homeland event at the Ministry of National Defense's Istanbul Shipyard Command.
Ülkemizin iftihar vesilesi olan savunma sanayimiz kelimenin tam anlamıyla her alanda destan yazıyor. Dostlarımız başarılarımızdan övgüyle bahsederken hasımlarımız endişe ve telaş içinde bizi yakalamaya çalışıyor. Varsın uğraşsınlar. Onlar koşacak ama onlar bizi yakalayamayacak.
To mark Aselsan's milestone anniversary, the country announced 3 major initiatives. These include the integration of the constituent systems of the steel dome defense shield into Turkey's inventory, the inauguration of 14 new Aselsan facilities, and the groundbreaking of the technology base, a hub expected to spearhead future innovations in defense technology.
Burada şunu iddia ile ifade etmek isterim. Bundan 100 yıl önce İstiklal Harbimiz nasıl ezilenlere umut aşılamışla savunma sanayi hamlelerimizde bugün mazlumlara cesaret veriyor.
Framing the industry's growth as both a national and humanitarian mission, the Turkish leader concluded.
Filistin'den Suriye'ye, Yemen'den Somali'ye, Sudan'dan Libya'ya nerede sıkıntı çeken bir kardeşimiz varsa Türkiye'nin başarılarıyla gurur duyuyor.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Umar.
Mustafa, let's start with the steel dome air defense system. Now, new parts were delivered on Wednesday, and now, Turkey has said, President Erdoğan has said on multiple occasions, the regional threat is real and Turkey could be attacked considering Israel's moves in the region. Now, Mustafa, when we look at this air defense system, tell me about the strategic autonomy that Turkey will now possess in countering regional threats with this new air defense system.
Umar, I can clearly say that we are right now living in anarchic international system, and anarchy means that there is no higher authority from the sovereign states in the international arena. And while the internal politics is hierarchic, the international politics is anarchic, and anarchic international system requires self-help system. And within this context, all states need to rely on their own steps, on national defense industry to survive in the international arena. And yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan praised Turkey's efforts to increase its independence on the national defense industry. As you know, on Wednesday, Aselsan delivered new components for Turkey's steel dome air defense system. It is a multi-layered air defense systems to protect Turkey's national security against potential security threats amid regional and international security challenges. As you know, Turkey has been heavily investing on its national national defense industry. Turkey is one of the most important countries in terms of producing drone systems. As you know, Turkish drones produced by Baykar proved themselves on the battlefield. Turkish drones paved the way for the liberation of the Karabakh from the Armenian occupation. On the other hand, Turkey is already exporting its drones to the countries worldwide, and Turkish drones are contributing to these countries' national defense capabilities. And on the other hand, we know that Turkey has been working on steel dome systems. You know, Turkey was looking for air defense systems from its Western allies within North Atlantic Treaty Organization during the civil war years in Syria, but except Spain, Western countries turned a blind eye to Turkey's security demands, and Turkey was looking for another options to increase its air defense capabilities, and Turkey purchased S-400 air defense systems from Russia. And following this situation, we know that United States excluded Turkey from the F-35 stealth fighter jets program, and United States imposed sanctions on Turkey under the CAATSA actions. We know that CAATSA means countering American adversaries through Sanctions Act. And in Turkish, we have a very well-known proverb, and it means that a bad neighbor makes you owner. And after that situation, Turkey started to invest in its own national defense industry. We know that right now Turkey is producing its own fighter jets, Kaan. Turkey made an agreement with Indonesia to sell Kaan stealth fighter jets to this Asian country, and it is clearly showing that Turkey's efforts to rebuild its own defense industry is yielding positive results in terms of strengthening Turkey's national defense capabilities. And I think that the Steel Dome project is advancing Turkey's defense capabilities amid rising regional tensions in the Middle East. We know that Israel is not only taking aim at Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank or Gaza. We know that Israel has been always looking for biggest geopolitical agenda in the region. Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is always talking about greatest and biggest Israel project, and it is posing a direct threat to Turkey's national security and territorial integrity. I think that Turkey's latest steps in the national defense industry will be helpful for deterring Israel's military actions in the region.
Mustafa, talking about Israel, tell me about the latest developments from the occupied Gaza Strip, because Netanyahu is continuing and intensifying his plans to fully occupy Gaza City. Where do we stand? Pope Leo as well has urged Israel to halt its collective punishment. He addressed people at the Vatican, and he said that Israel must stop killing children. Israel must provide aid, it must provide food to starved Palestinians. And obviously we know it's a man-made famine, right? Tell me what's the latest there, Mustafa.
Omar, right now, Israeli security forces are determined to fully occupy the Gaza Strip. And on the other hand, we know that people are being starved to death by the Israeli security forces. On the other hand, right now, starvation and malnutrition crises are gripping the occupied Palestinian territory. And amid dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza, international criticism is mounting on Israel. And right now, Israel is being diplomatically isolated from the international community. Except the United States, all Western countries are right now criticizing Israel's military actions in the occupied Strip. Yesterday, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged immediate ceasefire and cessation of conflicts in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza Strip. And it is evident that international criticism is mounting Israel right now. But on the other hand, we know that Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet is turning a blind eye to criticism coming from the western or eastern countries. They are still deepening their military campaign in the Gaza Strip. They are still taking aim at Palestinian civilians, and they are killing journalists to make them silent in the face of ongoing atrocities in the region. But we know that condemnation and criticism do not yield positive results in terms of upholding the Palestinian rights. We have to see some concrete steps and coercive measures from the international community, Western countries in particular. As you know, in September, world leaders will be gathering in New York to convene for the United Nations General Assembly meeting, and many countries, France in particular, are set to recognize the Palestinian statehood. Yes, it will contribute to international efforts to uphold Palestinian rights, but I can reiterate that we have to see some concrete steps from the international community. Coercive measures can include arms embargo and economic sanctions on Israel. I think if the international community takes coercive steps against Israel, I think Palestinian people will live in dignity and peace in their homeland.
Musa, just a few days ago, there were some disturbing statements coming out from Israel. Netanyahu said that he will recognize the so-called Armenian genocide. What are your views on that? And, you know, considering what we've seen over the last few years, Israel is not considering the atrocities in Gaza as a genocide, but the 1915 events are now being called a genocide. So what are your views on that, and how has the Turkish government reacted to these statements?
Well, since the very beginning of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza in October 7, 2023, as you know, Turkey has been trying to increase international awareness about Israel's genocidal acts and ethnic cleansing policies in the region. And Turkey's diplomatic efforts are yielding positive results in terms of recognizing the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people living in the occupied territories. And I think Turkey's geopolitical influence in the Middle East are pushing Israel's expectations and Israel's patience. And within this context, as you know, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made some statements about the so-called Armenian genocide allegations. Turkey is against the recognition of 1915 events by the international community as a genocide. But we know that many countries, including the United States, have already recognized the 1915 events as a genocide. But it doesn't change the historical facts. Turkey is always calling for international investigation into the 1915 events. Turkey is not hesitating to discuss what happened in 1915, but we know that some countries are trying to benefit from the historical tragedies, and within this context, Netanyahu made an announcement about the so-called Armenian genocide allegations. Turkish Foreign Ministry immediately issued a written statement condemning Netanyahu's statements about the 1915 events. We know that right now all countries, including Western nations, are accusing Israel of committing genocide in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza Strip. Turkey is also accusing Israeli decision makers of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Gaza Strip. And as the international criticism mounts on Israel, I think that Israeli decision makers are trying to distract Turkey's attention to what is happening in Gaza right now. But I don't think that Turkey will take a back step in terms of giving its support for the Palestinian cause. We know that Turkey has been always advocating for the Palestinian statehood based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. And it is disturbing Israel in the international arena, because we know that many countries are set to recognize the Palestinian statehood. Right now, Israeli decision makers are trying to taking aim at Turkey's political future or historical realities. But according to Turkey, statements coming from the Israeli decision makers are null and void, and Turkish decision makers, including President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, reiterate at every opportunity that Turkey will continue to be right side of the history, and Turkey will continue to reiterate its strong support for the Palestinian cause.
Mustafa, let's move to Syria. Now, Daily Sabah reported on Wednesday that the YPG is building tunnels in northern Syria, which is in violation of the agreement that was signed in March. Tell me more about that, and how is Turkey going to deal with these developments?
Umar, we know that PKK terror group is not only posing a huge threat to Turkey's national security and political stability. We know that they are also still active in northern Iraq and northern Syria. And we know that PKK terror groups, Syrian offshoot, PYD-YPG, is building tunnels in northern Syria. Turkish security forces have been closely monitoring latest developments, security developments in the northern part of the country. As you know, Turkish foreign policy makers have been in close contact with their Syrian counterparts to exchange views on the national security issues between two important neighbors in the Middle East. We know that Turkey is one of the most important countries, reaffirming its strong support for Syria's unitary structure and political stability. Within this context, as you know, in March, new rulers in Damascus reached an agreement with PYD-YPG-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces. Turkey has been always calling upon PYD-YPG to commit its commitments within this deal. But on the other hand, we know that PYD-YPG forces are trying to increase their cooperation with Israel. But Turkey is always warning PYD-YPG against any provocations in the region. As you know, Turkey has been conducted several counter-terrorism operations against PKK and its Syrian offshoot PYD-YPG in northern Syria. Turkey successfully eliminated terror threat within and beyond its borders. I think that right now Syrian security forces are preparing for another military operation in northern Syria to eradicate the terror threat in the region. And according to reliable sources on the ground, Turkey will militarily give its strong support for Syria's counterterrorism operations. They mentioned that Turkey will not directly involved in the operation, but Turkey will give air support and intelligence support to Syrian security forces. But the bottom line is that if PYD-YPG tries to establish a separate political structure in northern Syria, I personally think that Turkish military forces will be compelled to conduct another counter-terrorism operations in the region in terms of not only protecting Turkey's national security, but also ensuring the border security between Ankara and Damascus.
Mustafa, thanks for that update. We'll be right back with you.
You're welcome.
Turkey has warned that Israel's military operations in Syria are undermining efforts to restore peace and stability across the Middle East, stressing that the strikes violate the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Turkey has strongly condemned Israel's ongoing military operations in Syria, saying they violate the country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and regional stability. Ankara warned that the expanding scope of the strikes directly undermines efforts to restore peace both within Syria and across the wider region.
We strongly condemn Israel's military operations in Syria, which violate the country's territorial integrity, unity, and sovereignty, and which have been expanding in scope. These attacks directly target efforts to establish stability and security in Syria and across our region. They must be brought to an end, and support for the Syrian government's efforts to ensure peace and calm throughout the country should be sustained.
Turkey reaffirmed its readiness to continue supporting Syria through mutual agreements and regional priorities, emphasizing cooperation based on respect for national sovereignty. As Syria navigates a new era, Ankara reiterated its position that lasting peace will depend on inclusive governance, national reconciliation, and the elimination of terrorist threats, principles it pledged to uphold in its future support for the country.
We will continue to support a vision for Syria that is in line with the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people, one that is free from terrorism, secure, and preserves the country's territorial integrity.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the top stories from Daily Sabah. Mustafa, we were just talking about Syria, YPG making more tunnels in northern Syria, and you also told us that Turkey is preparing another counter-operation to fight that terror threat that's emanating from Syria. Now, Mustafa, let's focus on the first headline. Ankara endorses Damascus unity push. Tell me more about that.
Geopolitical landscape totally changed in Syria last December as the opposition forces took control over the country, and country's long-time ruling Assad family fled to Russia, and new geopolitical era begins for Syria. And since then, new Syrian rulers have been taking important steps to normalize the political situation in the country. And we know that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan welcomed his new Syrian counterpart Ahmet al-Shara several times in Turkey's Istanbul, Antalya and Ankara to discuss the possible steps to rebuild and reconstruct the country. And we know that Turkey is endorsing Syria's unity push. Within this context, as you know, Turkey signed several agreements with Syria to contribute to Syria's national security, unitary structure, political sovereignty and territorial integrity. And Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan on Wednesday reiterated Turkey's strong support for Syria's efforts to unite the country. Turkey believes that those who turn their faces to Ankara and Damascus will prevail, and those who seek new foreign patterns will fail. And it is a direct message to PKK terror groups, Syrian offshoot, PYD, YPG. I think that cooperation and collaboration between Turkey and Syria will yield positive results in terms of bringing long-standing peace and stability to the Middle East.
Mustafa, let's also talk about this picture, which is here from Kyiv. Over a dozen people were killed in yet another Russian airstrike. What do we know about the latest developments, and do you think there can be peace in Ukraine given Trump's push for a ceasefire?
Umar, Russia conducted new operations across Ukraine amid United States-led peace efforts. As you know, 2 weeks ago, U.S. President Donald Trump welcomed his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin to Alaska, and then he also hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders at the White House. And everyone was expecting immediate cessation of conflicts between Ukraine and Russia. But we have already warned that, yes, these negotiations are contributing to confidence-building measures between two warring sides, but we know that root causes of the conflict should be eliminated, and it is clearly showing that right now conflicts are raging on between Ukrainian and Russian security forces. I think that U.S. President Donald Trump will also express his frustration over Russia's increasing military activities in Ukraine. But if the international community wants to see peace and stability between Ukraine and Russia, I think they will be supposed to take some coercive measures. And right now, yes, they are increasing their diplomatic efforts to put an end to the ongoing conflicts in the region. But I think that only Turkey can play an important role between two warring sides in the region, because Turkey is trying to both facilitate and facilitating and mediating the peace talks between two warring sides. As you know, Turkey's Istanbul hosted several rounds of peace negotiations. On the other hand, Turkey is calling for a leader diplomacy to deal with the bilateral or multilateral security issues between two important neighbors in Eastern Europe. I think that Turkey's national security demands will be supposed to be taken into the consideration by the international community if they want to bring peace and stability to the region.
Mustafa, thanks for those updates.
Thank you, Mar.
Now let's take a look at this news report, and we'll be right back.
Russian forces launched a large-scale drone and missile attack on Kyiv, killing at least 15 people, including 4 children, and injuring dozens on Thursday, Ukrainian officials said. Homes and buildings across 7 districts bore the brunt of the attack. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said it showed Russia's answer to diplomacy amid efforts by US President Donald Trump to end the war. He called for new sanctions on Russia, which he said, quote, chooses to continue killing instead of ending the war. Rescue operations were underway across the city, with emergency services putting out the fires and sifting through the rubble. As the attack unfolded over 9 hours, some residents of the capital sheltered underground. The Ukrainian Air Force said it downed 563 of 598 drones and 26 of 31 missiles launched by Russia in a countrywide attack. Ukrainian officials said several high-rise apartment blocks had been hit, along with the headquarters of the European Union mission to Ukraine and the British Council. Critical infrastructure such as energy facilities and a railway hub in central Ukraine had also been struck. Russia's defense ministry said its attack hit military industrial facilities and military air bases. Moscow has regularly denied targeting civilians, but dozens have died in recent months during strikes on densely populated areas. Moscow's defense ministry said Russian air defense systems intercepted and destroyed 102 Ukrainian drones overnight, which had targeted at least 7 regions.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from Singapore is Laurent Lecault, the founder of the Macro Butler. Laurent, welcome to the program.
Hi, good morning, Umar. It's always a pleasure to be on Turkey Diplomacy.
Laurent, given the ongoing reconstruction efforts in Ukraine amid the conflict, how might regional powers like Poland and Germany financially benefit or face risks from investing in infrastructure projects? And what geopolitical shifts could arise if their support leads to increased EU debt burdens?
Well, I think before talking about reconstruction, I think that we need to take a step back and go back to the origin of the war. So, I mean, the special operation between Russia and Ukraine was mostly driven by Russia trying to protect the Russian minorities in the Donbass. Behind that, there's also a kind of a strategic look at the Donbass, because the Donbass region is quite rich in commodities like rare earths and coal. So I guess that, again, before talking about the reconstruction, first, I would say that a ceasefire or a peace treaty must be settled between Ukraine and Russia, and I think we are still far from there. And looking who could benefit from the reconstruction, I mean, in the case that a ceasefire or a peace treaty is signed between Russia and Ukraine, in fact, European countries are not really in a good shape because they are financially constrained. So I would think that in the let's say near future, in fact, we are most likely to still be in a wait-and-see mode regarding reconstruction. Longer term, I guess that President Trump is trying to push for U.S. companies to benefit mostly from the reconstruction of what would be left of Ukraine after the end of the conflict. And I guess we have also seen a lot of U.S. banks like BlackRock and JP Morgan already being quite active in trying to fund a potential reconstruction of Ukraine. So I would think at the end of the day that most likely would a ceasefire be reached. It could be, in fact, U.S. corporates which would benefit the most from the reconstruction of Ukraine. And don't forget, there's also a tentative rare earth deal between the U.S. and Ukraine. But as I just said, unfortunately for the U.S., most of the reserve of rare earths in Ukraine are located in the Donbass, and I don't really think that the Donbass will ever return under Ukraine leadership.
Laurent, so there's another conflict. Well, it's not a conflict, it's a genocide in the occupied Gaza Strip. So when we talk about the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians, so in the context of post-conflict rebuilding in Gaza, what role could Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE play in funding redevelopment through sovereign wealth funds? And what are the potential economic consequences for global oil markets if their involvement escalates regional tensions?
Well, I think there are also a lot of geopolitical and geostrategic interests in the Gaza Strip, and the unfortunate genocide that is ongoing is, of course, related to this. Again, if we go back to history and we look in the early 1970s, Israel stated a plan to build the Ben Gurion Canal, which was kind of a try to avoid the Suez Canal. And the original plan of the Ben Gurion Canal was to start from Eilat and to go across the Gaza Strip. I personally think, in fact, that in Prime Minister Netanyahu's mind, this project of a Ben Gurion Canal is still ongoing. And of course, it has a geopolitical and geostrategic interest because Israel and the West and also the US want to avoid to be reliant on the Suez Canal, which is under the control of Egypt. So here as well, I think that would a ceasefire or the end of the genocide in the Gaza Strip take place in the next few months or quarters, we could see the Gulf states being more active in the reconstruction of Gaza, but I think that they will be under the pressure of Israel because, as I said, I think that this conflict and this genocide in Gaza is mostly related to the interest of Israel to shortcut the Suez Canal and to create an alternative sea road outside the control of the Arab states.
Laurent, how do the wars in Ukraine and Gaza intersect with commodity re-rating trends, particularly in energy and metals? And what political implications might emerge if Western sanctions inadvertently empower non-aligned countries to dominate reconstruction financing?
Well, as I just said, if we look at Ukraine, there's clearly a potential big source of rare earths. And would the conflict end under the current state of affairs? I would think that most of the rare earths would be under the control of Russia. Of course, Ukraine is also a major supplier of agriculture commodities. So here as well, we have seen at the start of the conflict that supply chain for agriculture commodities have been disrupted, then have been restored under the support of Turkey. And also, clearly, there's the issue of natural gas and oil supply out of Russia into Europe. There are still a lot of European countries, especially Hungary and Slovakia, which are still buying Russian oil. We have seen over the past few weeks that Ukraine here as well has tried to stop this Russian oil supply to Hungary and Slovakia by bombing the pipeline that are supplying Russian oil to these countries. Would more sanctions be executed against Russia? And I think that the big deal is more sanctions against the other BRICS, which, like India and China, are now buying Russian oil at discount to the global oil market. I would think that this will increase the polarization of the world between the BRICS and the West. And in fact, next week, there will be a Shanghai Organization meeting in China, where Xi Jinping will meet with Modi and Putin. And for sure, at this meeting, we can expect that the three leaders of the BRICS, which are really the engines of the BRICS, will probably announce more trade relationship related to commodity supply. I mean, at the end of the day, what the West has managed to do is to create the union between Russia, China, and India. I mean, if you look back at history, these three countries have been ancestral enemies. But since 2022, and under the pressure of sanction, and now under the pressure of additional tariff, in fact, these three countries are increasingly integrating their economies. So you have clearly Russia being a source of natural resource, China being the state-of-the-art manufacturer of the world, and then India potentially becoming the new world's largest consumer economy. So I would think that the unification of these three countries, which I call a triumvirate, will in fact potentially drive economic growth in the next decade and will be the catalyst for the shift of the financial and economic power from the West to the East.
Laurent Lecoux, founder of the Macro Butler, thank you so much for that analysis and for being a part of the program today.
Thank you very much, Umar.
Anews editor Mustafa Kocakinar, thank you for being with us in the studios.
Thank you, Umar.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.